Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you join us from. My name is Jose Gesti. I'm working with the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership. And on behalf of the whole Secretariat, I welcome you to this webinar 3 on climate financing for WAS. This is the last webinar of our climate webinar series. And we are really excited about what is going to be discussed here today. Joe, please, if we can have the next slide. What we wanted to do is to situate first this webinar and the webinar series, and to make a quick recap of what has happened in the last 2 webinars to understand what is about to happen today on webinar 3 on climate financing. As you may know from the Secretariat, we have shared with all our partners a discussion guide on how to engage in country processes with the aim of, the ultimate aim of bringing together the WAS and the climate conversations, if you like. What you see on the screen is the essence of this discussion guide of these processes that we aim to see at the country level. And the webinar series, as you can see, is very well centered on unpacking a little bit what is the content of this discussion guide. Everything, as we've been reminding over the last webinars, everything starts with a stakeholder mapping, where the expectation is that the WAS sector will look a little bit around and see who are the stakeholders to partner with in order to embrace and work with climate resilience. This means that in some cases, we may need to be looking beyond the usual suspects or the usual partners, and we may need to start engaging more and more with ministries of environment, departments of climate change, etc. There are many different levels for stakeholders to be partnering with, whether it's at the national, subnational, or regional levels, or at the local level. And there are many constituencies, of course, to partner with in terms to embrace climate resilience in the WAS sector. This includes the private sector, includes academia, includes civil society, etc., etc. So based on that, the first discussion on our first webinar was on policy analysis. Those of you that participated in that webinar a few weeks ago, you may remember that we explained that this is a bidirectional process where, from an analytical point of view, analyzing policies, we need to understand whether national climate policy, which is, as we know, cross-sectoral, we need to identify whether WAS is well presented there. I just forgot to mention, sorry, I just forgot to mention the interpretation button that you may have on, you may see on the lower side of your screen, so that you will be able to check the language that you want to be translated. I'm using the English channel, and then I'm being translated into French, just to remind everybody that today we have in this first webinar, we have English and French translation. We will have a second session later on today where we will have Spanish and Portuguese interpretation as well. But please select your interpretation channel. As I was saying, after the stakeholder mapping, we dedicated the first full webinar, the first webinar into policy analysis. We were saying that this is a bidirectional process where we need to understand whether WAS is well represented into climate policy. And then the other way around, we also need to make the exercise of understanding whether the policies and strategies that we are more familiar with, the WAS strategies, whether climate is well represented, whether we've been able to bring a climate resilience perspective and a risk analysis into our WAS strategies and plans. These were the discussions on the first webinar. You may remember we had interesting discussions on how are the entry points for WAS into the national adaptation plans and the nationally determined contributions, etc. We often tend to see that it is not yet the case that WAS is well reflected into climate policy. We also need to acknowledge that in many cases, it's still not the case that climate resilience is well integrated into WAS strategies, policies, and plans. So to try to help with that, we dedicated a full webinar too into taking a look on what can be done to overcome that situation. We have, in that case, the Global Water Partnership presented a tool that is a WAS risk assessment. It's a participatory approach that you can use in countries to conduct climate risk assessments, which at the end we saw it is divided into 4 components of assessment of hazards, assessment of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, because this is going to give us all the information that is needed to move on in this flow diagram and then be able to identify and appraise what are the worst climate resilient solutions that we need to be employing in our specific context, right? So there is no way that we can work with climate resilient WAS approaches if we don't have a clear idea of what are the risks that the climate risk that we are facing. To illustrate some of the work that is done at the sector with the identification and appraisal of options, we have presentations by WaterAid, by the World Health Organization and UNICEF, presenting different frameworks that are already being used in countries to cluster climate resilient solutions at different levels, whether it's national, subnational, or local, to work with climate resilient approaches to water safety planning, it was explained, etc. It is now that we've gone through all these important components of these country processes that we arrive to the climate financing discussion. It is important for us that you understand that jumping directly into the climate financing discussion may not work, is not going to work if we haven't gone through the previous steps of identifying whether WAS is already integrated into climate policy at national level and therefore is a national priority or not, whether we have a clear view in the WAS sector to what are the climate risks that we are facing. It's very difficult otherwise if we don't go through these steps that we arrive in a good shape, if you like, to be putting proposals for climate financing. Here, I would like to also to make this call, right? When we have talked about the policy analysis, we have said that this is a bidirectional process, right? Where we are aiming at having WAS well integrated into climate policies, but also the other way around, having climate well integrated into WAS. Here in webinar 3, we're going to see some of the key features of some climate financing schemes. We will see what is the rationale and how proposals, what the proposals need to have in order to make it and be able to benefit from climate financing schemes. But this is also a call for us in the water sector to be doing our part, as I said, and making sure that we understand that we cannot jump into climate financing without having a proper view of the risk that we are facing, without understanding what are the different climate financing schemes, what are the requisites that we need to comply with in order to apply to the different schemes. I was once in a discussion with a high-level official from the Global Environmental Facility. This is an experience that I had. I was told, Jose, it's going to be very difficult for you in the water sector to see proposals coming on speaking, for example, on sanitation. And I said, but why? And this person told me, it's clear to us, Jose, it's like we are working from a climate financing perspective cross-sectorally. We don't have the expertise in all the sectors. And simply for us, it's very difficult to see what are the linkages, for example, between sanitation and climate change. So unless you as a sector tell us what are these links and how can we work with these links and what is the rationale for these proposals that you want to make to climate financing, it's going to be very difficult for us otherwise to understand the rationale of these proposals. All this to say that from our side, we need to do as much as possible to speak the climate narrative that is needed when aiming at tapping climate financing. So you see, this is the picture of the 3 webinars that we have lined up. The good news is that SWA continues with another set of webinars in June. This will be more fully dedicated to financing. This webinar today serves as a transition because we are discussing both topics in the same webinar, climate and financing, but there is a full dedicated series of webinars in June, and you will have more information later on. But without further ado, then Joao, if you can have please the next slide. As you can see, I've done already my part of opening this webinar and making the introduction. We have now situated where this webinar 3 fits within this series of webinars. And then we're going to have a presentation by WaterAid, Jonathan Fary, who's going to speak on the Water Resilient Accelerator, and is going to give us some key information on a climate financing landscape that was done recently by WaterAid and the Overseas Development Institute. We will get an interesting presentation as well from UNDP, Pradeep. We'll talk on some of the perspectives on climate financing for WAS from a UNDP perspective. And we have today a country case study, Togo case study. We have the government of Togo speaking, the Ministry of Environment, on a proposal that is being developed right now for the Green Climate Fund, and that it has a strong focus on water resources and WAS. We are also delighted to have two distinguished discussants. We have Alejandro Jimenez from CIBI and Kathleen Dominic from OECD. I will introduce them properly later as we move on with this webinar. We also have a space for questions and answers. But at this point, I would like to invite you, please, to use the chat box diligently. We are trying to have a focused discussion on climate financing today, and we will use the chat box, please, only to reflect on issues that relate with this webinar and climate financing. And you can make your comments, you can put your questions there, and we will try to gather them and have some time for discussion at the end, or if we have time, we can even try to have them in between. I hope at this point that we have Jonathan Fary from WaterAid.
Yes.
Ready? If we can have the next slide. Jonathan Fary is Senior Climate Advisor for WaterAid. Jonathan, the floor is yours. If you can walk us through this very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thanks again for organizing these amazing webinars and for your team, and good morning to everybody. As I said, my name is Jonathan Fary, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor at WaterAid. I'm just going to talk a little bit through some of our work on climate finance and our analysis that we've done. If I next slide, please. I mean, I shouldn't need to explain this to you. I mean, everyone knows that basically, climate change is water change, and those people with the least ability to adapt are those who lack basic and safe to manage access to wash. And of course, least developed countries who've done the least to cause climate change, very low carbon emissions profile, will experience significant impacts from climate change, perhaps in some cases much more than we'll feel in the global north, for those of you in the global north. And of course, communities have very little capacity to identify the impacts of climate change as they're happening, and let alone prepare for the future impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So we feel that at WaterAid, that given the clear links between climate change and water, there should be significant climate finance available for supporting water programs, and particularly the whole point surely has to be to support the poorest communities to adapt and to be resilient against its impacts. And so in 2020, last year, we commissioned the Overseas Development Institute to look at how much money was actually going to water programs from climate finance. And so they looked at all the funding that had taken place, tracked by the OECD DAC statistics, everything with climate involved and water involved, and produced a very interesting analysis. And the good news is that this, every year about $600 billion or more gets spent on climate change. So we need to see money spent on climate change. We need to cut carbon as quickly as possible, because otherwise the impacts are going to get worse. But unfortunately, the bad news is that only 5% of that money goes to adaptation and resilience, and that means it's not getting through to the poorest countries because they don't have a lot of carbon to cut in the first place. And of that, 5% which goes to adaptation resilience, only about half of that, 3% of the total, goes to water programs. And of that, only 1% of public finance, so which is about $700 million a year, is a lot. So it shows that our programs are going on, but it's not enough given the scale of the challenge we face, is going to basic water systems to wash. I mean, it's, there's obviously wash is often linked up with other systems, so it's not absolutely clear, but it shows that how much there is, it's not enough. WaterAid did a bit of back of the envelope calculations, and that money worked out as about $1 per person per year in the countries where we work. So it's just by any metric, it's simply not enough money. And of that, and just to rewind slightly, of that money which is going through to water programs as a total, only, or going to adaptation, of the top 20 recipients, only one of them was the least developed countries, that's Bangladesh. All the rest of the country were middle-income countries who had that capacity to apply for the finance. Meanwhile, those potentially of the greatest need in the Sahel, in South Asia, were still continuing to struggle. Next slide, please. And why is this? So, of course, it's not because of overall we've there's pledges of 100 billion towards tackling climate change, and we've seen the Green Climate Fund and others pledge to have a 50-50 split between their adaptation and mitigation spend. But of course, it's challenging because there's as yet still low awareness internationally about the cost of slow action on climate change. There's still the issue with adaptation compared to low carbon activities is that adaptation, the impacts of climate change may be a global crisis, but the impacts are all locally and depend very much on local geography, and therefore it's hard to centrally design a program, and therefore hard to centrally apply for funding. There's all very dispersed and diffuse projects, often parts of other projects. So it's it doesn't work very well within the current arrangements for international development. And of course, at the moment, as we know, although obviously water is incredibly valuable and absolutely vital component of any economy, a water program doesn't always yield the same potential direct returns as, for example, if you invest in a solar farm where you can charge for electricity or so forth. And of course, as we all know, working in the development sector, investing in least developed countries can also be challenging because of low capacity and the technical barriers to identify specific climate impacts and to understand the sort of geography of various different environments. Often these are complex problems. Climate change is a huge threat to development, but it's not the only threat by any stretch of the imagination. As we've seen last year, there's huge potential for impacts on health. So we can't say this program is just a climate program. We need to be able to link it up with different issues, and of course, it's many investors see those countries as being high risk. Next slide, please. So what needs to change? We need, first of all, we need a massive uplift in urgency. We need it anyway to meet SDG 6. We've got a lot of work to do over 10 years to ensure that people have access to water. But as we see these threats to the quality and quantity of water that's available, that only increases the rate at which we have to work. And of course, if we did that early investment, we'd avoid all sorts of crises and potentially save money. I mean, WASH has a huge potential benefit. So therefore, and that is as true for climate resilience as it is for anything else. We also need to start joining up more across different sectors. As Jose was saying in his introduction, the WASH sector needs to start speaking and having a shared dialogue with the climate sector, but also, of course, it's related to planning, to the wider water sector, water resources and agriculture and so forth. And we have to prepare to recognize that even what we can do in a single WASH program won't solve all the threats to water, and therefore we need to work more collaboratively. And of course, we need to have huge amounts of data, because to build programs and also to assess long-term threats, because they're going to be unpredictable, but we know they're only going to get significantly worse in terms of their scale, which is a huge challenge because, of course, that requires stamina and resources that relatively few organizations, even some governments, lack. And that is, again, why we need to collaborate. And that's, one of the sort of aims of the SWA, of course, is to foster that international action. Next slide, please. And just to give one example of some of the work that WaterAid is doing, recognizing that critique we've just done, is that we've launched, the Prince of Wales earlier this year, on World Water Day launched our Resilient Water Accelerator. And the main aim of that is recognizing the increased effort and recognizing the increasing need for capacity and data. We're trying to unlock climate finance for project preparation, recognizing if we can establish a lot of the facts on the ground, if we can aim for the sort of big challenges and trying to link up with different sectors. This is an expensive way to do to prepare a program, but if we do it right, then we can reap all the benefits of getting that analysis and that proposals right in the first place. And of course, it also recognizes that it can be a lot of work to bring everyone together, but it's absolutely essential if we're going to bring together water resources, ecosystems, and disaster risk reduction sectors. Next slide, please. There is the next slide. Skip this slide, please. Sorry, that's I need to lose that one. And lastly, the next steps. We're working with SWA and UNICEF and many others to finalize the design of our accelerator and start the first round of programs. Hopefully we get secure the locations and funding for those programs ahead of COP26. And we want to use this not as the answer to everything, but to demonstrate this practical approach to tackling overlap. Yes, hello.
Sorry to interrupt. It
Apologies.
seems that we are having apologies for that. I think we're having a little issue right now with the translation into French.
Oh.
We're trying to sort out. I would ask you please 1 second, see if we can get this arranged.
No problem. Apologies as well if I'm talking too quickly. I just had a coffee.
No, I don't think it's an issue of the speed. I think something. Yeah, well, they are asking us to sleep
no
slow down a little bit.
I've almost finished anyway. I believe this is my last slide.
Are we okay to go on, Lucia, with the, or Larissa, if you can please indicate if we can continue.
Yes.
It's okay now? Okay, thank you. Please go on.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. No, not at all. So just to finalize, our aim, WaterAid, we work in 27 countries around the world, and one of our aims is to work widely with both local, national, and international partners. And we want to demonstrate a practical approach to these overlapping water crises. There's 2 billion people who don't have access to safely managed water. The potentially 5 billion people who may face water stress by middle of the century. And of course, the increasingly terrifying stories of the disasters and ecosystems collapse. And we think, given that it's all the water sector, we need to work together. But of course, no matter how well the water sector works, if people can't access it, they can't be resilient and they can't respond to climate threats. And and our aim, therefore, is at the COP meeting 26, and for every COP meeting going forward, is to continue to raise the plight of those people and the need for urgent action. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Jonathan. Thanks for that. Was very, very interesting, and also, some of the highlights, as I noted, the call that is not just the WAS sector to discuss with climate colleagues, is within our own broader water sector and the interface between WAS and water resources management, which obviously, with climate financing and the development of proposals, we have a good opportunity to make the right connections, right? I think it's also very interesting to remind some of the figures that you have shared with us, with only 1% of total, the total climate financing going to basic water sanitation and hygiene. And as you said, the efforts that we understand that multilateral schemes such as the Green Climate Fund are doing to try to balance adaptation and mitigation, the financing going for both, but still, it's very unbalanced at the moment with climate financing towards mitigation rather than adaptation. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. That was very, very interesting. And now, what we're going to do is we're going to transition into the next presentation. And for the next presentation, we have Mr. Pradeep Kulasurija. Sorry for the misspelling. It's Pradeep is Director for Nature, Climate and Energy and Executive Coordinator for the Environmental Finance at UNDP. We have Pradeep joining us live in the next session, but he's living in the US, is in the middle of the night there, and we got a recorded presentation from Pradeep for this first session. If you're interested in interacting more likely with him later on, he will be joining our second session. But for the moment, Joe, if we can have Pradeep.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Kurukula Surya. I'm at UNDP. I'm the Director for Nature, Climate and Energy, where I lead UNDP's work to support countries to access finance and funding for various nature, climate and energy related initiatives. I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about our experiences of working with these funds in the hope that it provides some useful insights to you as you embark on your own individual efforts to secure resources for WASH-related initiatives. Just to lay the context, I've been working with UNDP for the last 15, 16 years. And during this time, this portfolio has increased nearly 4 or 5-fold from what it was when I first started. It's currently more than $5 billion worth of resourcing, which we've been able to help countries around the world to access to address their priorities on nature, climate, and energy, including about 1.2 billion for adaptation alone in more than 100 countries around the world. The water-related initiatives within this portfolio, we do have quite a number of them, so we're quite experienced in securing resources for water initiatives. Over the last few years, we've secured since 2008 about $764 million worth of resourcing, which in turn have leveraged about 1.8 billion in co-financing for around 54 projects around the world. And right now, these resources are supporting more than 2.3 million beneficiaries, from increasing access to drinking water to practicing integrated water resources management, and creating supporting subnational national entities to create water management plans, which hopefully will help them with their governance related initiatives. Now, our main areas of work in UNDP, and I will draw on this experience to share with you the lessons that we have gleaned from working with these funds, falls into water management, catchment rehabilitation, sustainable land management issues, which often touch on water-related issues. We've supported a number of countries to access resourcing for drinking water, including for domestic use. We have supported countries with a number of initiatives around coastline management, including restoration and construction of seawalls and other things to mitigate the impacts of floods and flooding. And finally, in the practice of integrated water resource management systems, including capacity development for the development and implementation of water management plans. Most of these resources that we work with have been secured under the various funds that exist under the UNFCCC. The Green Climate Fund is one of them, the Adaptation Fund is another, and also the Global Environment Facility. These funds are there for countries to access with the support of an accredited entity such as UNDP or FAO or UN Environment or the World Bank. They are replenished every 4 years. Some of these funds, such as the Global Environment Facility, has dedicated resources for specific streams of work, focal areas as they call it. And they also serve as instruments to finance various priorities under different conventions. The Green Climate Fund, of course, is the most recent of all of these funds. It was set up in 2010, and it has a mandate to support climate action, both on adaptation and mitigation, with an equitable distribution of resources for these two priorities. I'm not going to get into more details about these funds because that's not the objective of this session, but you can acquire a lot of information about these funds from their websites. And of course, if any further information is needed, we're happy to provide our colleagues at UNICEF. Now, I want to talk about a little bit on the requirements of these funds as it relates to WASH. So the Green Climate Fund, let's start with that. It has a number of investment criteria. For those of you who are not familiar with it, one of the very first criteria is the impact potential, which is really, what is the impact that this program or project, what will it have in terms of the funds results areas. They look for initiatives that really is not business as usual, but which will change the paradigm around a number of important issues. So if your objective is to find resources for WASH initiatives that typically have been done for many years, and there are many other funds that do similar things, the Green Climate Fund will probably not be as enthusiastic about those initiatives as other funds. They want different, business models, approaches practiced with the use of their resources, and it's incredibly important that the case for a paradigm shift is made in the context of what's requested. The sustainable development potential is also important, so the cross-cutting benefits across different priority areas. Obviously, the needs of the recipient is an important consideration, and country ownership. So they very much look for initiatives where it is not us, such as UNDP or FAO or UNEP, that is really at the driving seat. It's really the country. The country is in charge of execution, of implementing the projects. The role of agencies such as ours is to support those countries and ensure that the resources are used for what they're meant to do. And finally, of course, investment criteria on efficiency and effectiveness, and this really goes into the heart of why you would use grant funding and the nature of concessionality as it relates to the projects under question. The access procedures are quite intense. There is typically it takes about 2 years for us to go from an idea to a board, and in between there are various milestones that have to be met, including a concept development stage, a funding proposal development stage. Then there's quite an intensive review process, first with the Secretariat and then with an independent technical advisory panel before a project goes to board and it is approved. For us, typically, 2 years is normal to go through this part of the cycle. It is not uncommon that sometimes it takes longer, about 3 years. And the reason for this is, there's a lot of information and data and modeling that needs to be done in order to make the case for these resources. And that takes time. Some of these things cannot be rushed. To pull together a proposal that is acceptable for the Green Climate Fund in terms of resourcing, sometimes you need up to about $500,000 worth of resourcing to acquire all of the data. The fund does provide assistance with securing resources for design, and that's something that can be explored together with the fund. After the projects are approved, then there is another process that starts, which triggers the disbursement of resources. There is a agreement that has to be signed. There is a period of execution and effectiveness. Government signatures, after which you get the first disbursement from the fund, and then and there's an inception period, and then you move towards annual reporting. There's obviously adjustments that take place in these projects which last 5-6 years. There are evaluations done regularly, as well as a final evaluation before you close it. So typically, this part of the process can be 6 years, depending on the duration of the project. Each of these steps can take a significant amount of time, depending on the complexity of the project in question. The Global Environment Facility, it is again set up in a very similar manner. You have a council that reviews and approves proposals. There's a secretariat that works with agencies, and there are quite a few of them that are able to support countries, and the GEF also, like the GCF, focuses on bespoke areas such as blue economy, improving governance in areas of national jurisdiction, enhancing water security in freshwater ecosystems. So some of these areas could accommodate related initiatives, but I would say the scope is probably narrower in the GEF than it is in the GCF. The GEF also houses several other funds. One is the LDCF and SECF. These are adaptation funds. These are voluntary funds which countries can access in order to secure resources. We have had a number of wash-related initiatives that have been funded through these funds. But like the GCF, there are certain requirements that they look for: innovation, partnerships, mainstreaming across different national policies, and the like. The Special Climate Change Fund also has its own peculiarities. Typically, with the SCCF, unlike the LDCF, which is dedicated for least developed countries, with the Special Climate Change Fund, it's typically accessed more by the middle-income countries. Both these funds are voluntary in nature, so therefore the amount of resourcing available is somewhat a little bit unpredictable, but they are very popular, and a great source of resourcing for countries that want to access resources fairly quickly. The GEF also has a project cycle that it employs, and there's a stepwise process that one has to go through from design to approval. I think as my final input to the conversation, what I would say with all of these funds is the need to establish a clear case for climate change additionality. This is an important concept. It takes its roots in the UNFCCC and the climate negotiations, where one has to establish a clear climate rationale for the resources that are being requested. Now, what that means is that at the end of the day, you have to make a case that there is a scientific rationale for climate impacts on the sector that you're interested in. So if it is WASH, then is a need to ensure that with scientific data and modeling exercises, including secondary analysis that has been done, sometimes involving primary research, to establish that there is a clear climate signal that is warranted and that affects the sector in question, and that these resources, when applied, will address that additional climate change risk on the key sector. So if this is about securing resources for WASH in general, which understandably will reduce vulnerabilities for certain, these funds are not the resources that you need. Because very often, if you make that case that we're not doing anything that explicitly recognizes climate change risks, these interventions aren't geared towards future risks that are likely to emerge from climate change, and we have established a clear link between climate and water resources in question, then it's going to be harder to establish the rationale for why these specific funds ought to be used for the intended purpose. This is the hardest part, I have to say, with many of these funds, establishing that climate rationale. And part of the challenge it is because countries don't have the data that's needed, sometimes the skills that are required. It takes time to undertake the necessary analysis and draw conclusions which are conclusive, that really strengthen the case for requiring accessing finance These kinds of things can delay matters. But it is an important consideration to have when planning for and designing these initiatives. So my advice is, if you are interested in pursuing these funds for WASH related initiatives, please do invest the time upfront to acquire the data and the scientific rationale for the climate signals as it relates to WASH. I hope this has been useful to give you an overview of the key issues. I apologize I couldn't be there with you myself to deliver this, but I wish you very well in your deliberations. Thank you.
Great. So this was, as you can see, this was a very good presentation from Pradeep, explaining us different differences between these climate financing schemes. We've seen the Green Climate Fund, we've seen the investment criteria, we've seen the Global Environmental Facility and some of the satellite climate funds. Also, the Adaptation Fund has been mentioned. There was a question in the chat box about civil society being able to make proposals to these funds. We don't have now Pradeep live, so that I cannot give him the floor, but I can tell you that these climate financing schemes go through a very rigorous accreditation process. Only accredited entities, once they've gone through this process, can make proposals. That doesn't mean that they are the only ones being able to work around these funds. Obviously, the accredited entities can also work in partnership. Indeed, the case study that we will see after is a case study that Togo, it's a Togo proposal to the Green Climate Fund, which is being developed in partnership between obviously the government of Togo, as Pradeep has reinstated. It's important to have the country ownership, and the countries are in charge, and agencies that are accredited are just helping governments to go through this process. But we will, this Togo proposal that we will see after, it's driven by the government of Togo, and then UNDP as an accredited entity. UNICEF is also working with UNDP. In that case, for example, UNICEF is not an accredited entity yet to the Green Climate Fund, but that doesn't mean that collaborations cannot be put in place to develop proposals. There was also a question, well, who can access, but also in the case of Mali, there was a question in the chat box on how can Mali benefit from having proposals and having these funds going towards water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And I could just very briefly mention, what we have already explained at the beginning is there is a whole process that we need to bear in mind from the wash sector in order to be able to benefit from the climate financing, starting by understanding what are the risks that the water supply and sanitation sector is facing. In this case, the question was for Mali, understanding what are the impacts of climate change in water supply and sanitation in your local context is key to be able to put forward the adaptation and resilient options that you need financing for. Those need to be incorporated. Therefore, the policy analysis that we mentioned need to be incorporated as part of the national priorities, because when you are developing proposals for these climate financing schemes that we are seeing today, you will need to demonstrate early on at the concept stage that whatever you are suggesting to get climate financing from is indeed a national priority. Therefore, we have a full dedicated webinar, the first webinar of this series, to look for entry points on how WAS can be included as a national priority for adaptation or indeed for mitigation. I will just, before I hand over to our next presenter, just to emphasize what the point of discussion where we are right now, that Pradeep was mentioning on the climate change additionality, the climate rationale, call it how you like it, right? We tend to call it the climate rationale. It starts to be a little bit mysterious. What is this climate rationale? In the webinar number 1, it was referred to as the climate narrative. This is nothing else than developing proposals for the water supply and sanitation and hygiene sector that speak to what is the climate signal, and Pradeep was also referring, is what, therefore, the importance of conducting risk assessments and understanding, again, what are the climate hazards, what are the levels of exposure, and how communities are vulnerable, and how are we, through the interventions that we put in these proposals, we help decrease the vulnerability, decrease the exposure to climate hazards. These are the things that we need to have in mind. And nothing better now to transition into seeing what is going on at the country level. And we have now a very interesting presentation from Togo. We are all going to learn how Togo is going right now through this process of developing proposal for the Green Climate Fund that has a strong focus on water supply and sanitation. For that, we have Mr. Eso Sam Agri-Nam, who is a National Green Climate Fund focal point, working at the Ministry of Environment in Togo. Unfortunately, we cannot have Mr. Eso Sam live with us right now, but we have a recorded presentation from Togo. Mr. Eso, if we can please play it now.
Merci. Je disais tantôt que nous avions commencé.
I would like to say that this idea started a year ago,
and as you can see,
and as you
when
see,
it comes to the changes in the
when it comes to the national context,
we realized
we have
that
more
rainfalls
rain,
have increased, the dry
we've got
seasons
longer
are
drought
longer,
seasons,
and there's a lot of variability.
Variations regarding rainfalls.
And we can see
noticed
several
a certain number of
contrasts.
contrasts.
That we have floods,
about floods.
but
we've had quite a lot
also
of them
experienced
in
droughts.
our countries from 1925 to 1992,
and
we've had 1992,
we've
floods,
had
but very many
floods,
drafts.
But we've also
in
had severe
1942, 43,
42,
also.
76,
so regarding
83,
the climate scenarios,
phenomena will continue to
Can we please stop the video 1 second, Joao? So we are having an issue because it seems that we have the two translation channels in the same channel. So when I'm in the English channel, I'm hearing both translators. I don't know if there is anything we can do about it. Colleagues, Larissa, Lucia, is there something that we can do? Or shall we just otherwise play the recording in the original version?
Jose, I think just one of them have to speak, but I think they are aware now.
Yeah, okay, so we can continue. Perfect. Sorry about this interruption.
Également la réduction des précipitations. Et cela a un effet sérieux sur un peu.
This is a serious impact regarding, this has an impact on the availability of water. So we see in Togo that we have different seasons, but already in November, we do not have any more water in our rivers. We have less resources regarding groundwater. So there are problems that are not dependent from climate changes. We notice pressures regarding our water resources and our sanitation services that are already insufficient today and are not enough regarding to our needs. So we do not have enough supplies, and we see that in the regions where there are most risks of droughts and floods. An example, in rural zones, 21% of the population depends from surface water. And 22 more people use some source of water that has not been improved. Regarding agriculture, the situation is worsening because of the drought. And if we look at the coffee area, in June, we should have the flower season. And for the next season, it has a catastrophic impact. And then there is a problem regarding soils and the degradation of soils because of droughts. Transparent. Suivant. Next slide. Do you hear me? Next slide.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
So regarding that context, many of our projects made it possible for us to get rid of some barriers that we need to get rid of before starting different activities. We noticed that there was an imbalance between the institutional disposition, provision, and the management of water in the sector. We need water infrastructures for domestic use and agriculture use. And we need to be able to be resilient when it comes to collecting water, sharing water, and even storing water. And then you have the problem of drought that makes it worse. And there is a limited knowledge at the national level when it comes to consultancy, resilience for the integrated management of water and also sanitation. Next slide. Next slide. So those 5 barriers led us to analyze the problem, and that is linked to the project that we are creating, consolidating resilience for vulnerable communities in Togo regarding the impact of climate change, regarding the integrated water resource management. So we need to innovate regarding the water sanitation, but also mobilizing water resources that are very sensitive to climate. The activities that we will start, we are designing them. We want to build different type of sanitation infrastructures in order to be resilient to climate change. If we look at the kinds of latrines that we have, how do we manage this additionality? This is our challenge. And the speaker before talked about the climate rational, and this is what we are talking about. We must take into account those climate shocks, those climate crises, and we have partners within this process, UNICEF, GWP, UNDP, and the Green Climate Fund, and then the state working together with us. So within our roadmap, we need our feasibility study. Next slide. Next slide. So the expected results, we want to consolidate the institutional capacity and implement a resilient management and a sustainable management of water resources, taking into account the climate risks and the management of the wash sector at the national, subnational, and community level. So we will have to look at the standards we have regarding sanitation, integrate climate resilience, look at the supply question and the climate risk question. We must improve our institutional capacity and community capacity regarding planification for climate change and the availability of water. So the climate risk question must be integrated, and the answers one provides regarding water and sanitation. And we also need to raise awareness in schools and different organizations through our educational national programs to integrate this climate change question in our school programs. Next slide, please. Next slide. We also want to build infrastructure, resilient climate infrastructures in order to capture water, to store and manage water. And we need to assess climate risks, design, build, and work on the rehabilitation of the water infrastructures that we have, the sanitation infrastructures that we have. So we have different risks. They might take place in 5 years, in 10 years, and we need to take them into account. When it comes to latrines, before we only build latrines, now we need to integrate climate risks while building our latrines in ordinary zones, in sanitation zones. And private investment will be mobilized in order to get access to resilience, climate resilience technologies. And we also need to use solar power in order to make it possible for us to supply and treat our water. So we need to implement different practices to take into account the climate risks at the national, regional, and local level in order to lower the climate risks linked to water and sanitation, implementing the integrated management water resources. Next slide, please. just started, and we have a certain number of challenges. At the national level, we have designed a national coordination framework, and we have a technical and an executive board with different partners working with us. And this makes it possible for us to collect information. We need to have data. If one has a team that is working on awareness raising, it's good. Then we have a technical team, and it approves all the consultants that we have. And this is this information is given to the steering committee. At the national level, we didn't have all that. The experts, the consultants made it possible for us to have access to all this, so that we were able to give a number. From the beginning of the project, there were lots of discussions concerning the link between the climate sector and the wash sector, how to make this rational clear. We've been working on that to be able to convince the Green Fund, because it is difficult for us to show this rational, this additionality. It is a challenge, and the experts are helping us. And then national ownership, I want to thank all our partners to be available at all time. Each time we need data, solution, they're there, organizing meetings to make sure that we validate the processes. So this is really something positive that makes it possible for us to go forward. In October, we think that we will have a feasibility study and a concept note in order to go forward with our application to the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that was what I had to say about the experience of the Togo. We are a country in Western Africa. We have Benin, Burkina Faso, and Ghana are as neighbors with a coast of 150 kilometers. Thank you.
Great. That was a very good presentation from the Ministry of Environment in Togo that has walked us through how they are going through this interesting process of developing a proposal for the Green Climate Fund. As you have already seen, it's not an easy task, and we are coming back to the same issues, right? The difficulties of getting the narrative, the climate narrative, and the linkages between water supply and sanitation interventions, the linkages to climate. So this comes as an essential part. And again, Mr. Esso was emphasizing the national ownership. And we've seen as well what we were talking before on how is this a collaborative approach to develop this proposal with different organizations supporting the Ministry of Environment and Togo government with the development of this proposal that goes beyond water supply and sanitation, and also embraces water resources management, which is something that Jonathan in his initial intervention has also reminded us. I think that this presentation might be also helpful to answer some of the questions in the chat box. We have some colleagues joining from Madagascar who were putting the question, are we not talking too much about water and where is the sanitation? I think through this presentation, we've been able to dive in a little bit into the sanitation as well. Mr. Eso was emphasizing how, in order to have latrines and sanitation part of this proposal, what is really needed is to demonstrate and explain what are the impacts of climate change on sanitation. Pradeep, in his presentation from UNDP, has reminded us that this climate financing is not to finance what is could be considered business as usual. In the chat box, the comment from Madagascar was referring on how can these funds help with eliminating open defecation. Eliminating open defecation, if it doesn't come with a strong climate signal and a strong climate rationale as to why climate change is having an impact on this, is likely not going to be financed with climate financing. It's the same message that we want to make clear. Hopefully, comes very clear through this webinar. It's not going to happen if we just from the water sector we put proposals that can be considered business as usual. Eliminating open defecation is part of the SDG agenda. It's super important. We all understand that. But if we want to go in this direction of tapping green climate fund or climate financing, we need to go the step ahead and demonstrate the links. Obviously, as you can understand, the links between the lack of access to sanitation and flooding events, it's an obvious one, right? We also emphasize that the lack of access to water supply and droughts is another clear avenue for us to start with a narrative on the climate rationale for WAS. But I think now we transition into the last part of this webinar, which is we have two distinguished discussions with us, and I think we need to benefit from having them with us to, as much as possible, hear from them what they have to, the remarks they have to make based on their thinking and what they have heard so far. So first, we have Alejandro Jimenez. I don't know, Joao, if you can please help us with them. So we have Alejandro Jimenez, who is the director for the Water and Sanitation Department at the Stockholm International Water Institute. Alejandro, I could invite you to share with us some remarks on the perceived challenges that you think the water sector is facing to benefit from climate financing, and also if you have some remarks on what you have seen and heard today. Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you to SWA for organizing this very interesting webinars, and to yourself as well for leading those. Yeah, I mean, I think the presenters have already highlighted a number of issues, and I would like to come back to a few of them to get a step back. No, from the first report by WaterAid, we hear that only 5% of climate finance is given to adaptation, and only 3% to water programs, and then that there is no correlation between the need. If we measure that by for example, the least developed countries that receive funding and those that are receiving, only one in the 20 top recipient is an LDC. Just to remember also something that has been mentioned by Pradeep in the other discussion, in the other presentation, is that many of these funds have the plea or the ambition to have a 50% split between adaptation and mitigation. And as I have just mentioned, we are only giving 5% to adaptation. So we are not to the countries that mostly need it. So actually, one of my main reflections is that we are doing something wrong, or we are not reaching what we should be reaching. And I have also the feeling that the technical issues and the technicalities behind the access to climate funds is part of what is hindering us to reach what we should be doing at the end of all these complicated processes, right? I just want to mention as well that one of the aspects that the funds have, and Pradeep has illustrated from the Green Climate Fund, is that one of the principles is the needs of the recipients. And we then heard from Togo very worrying figures as 20% of people drinking on surface water, or he hasn't mentioned, but you can find in some regions over 70% of people practice open defecation within the country. So for me, the question is, okay, how do we match these needs to the climate rationale, no, that we've just mentioned? And I think this climate rationale has to do with the additionality, no? The additionality principle, which is very important, as Pradeep mentioned. And the additionality has two sides, no? One side is to be sure that the climate funding is not, is in addition to other funding. Okay, and that speaks to then being sure that is something that is really addressing climate issues, right? So it's not, as you have just said, business as usual. But I want to remind one thing, because Pradeep was also mentioning, and you have just mentioned, okay, we need the models, we need the data, we need all this scientific part of demonstrating the climate thing. And this is right now exactly true. But is it how it should be? And that is my question, because I just want to quote one thing from the IPCC, the fifth assessment report on adaptation measures. And one of the things it says is, and I quote, "The most effective actions to reduce vulnerability relate to basic public health measures, such as the provision of clean water and sanitation, health services, and alleviate poverty." So that speaks to something that is a little bit of also common sense. What kind of adaptation capacity are you going to have if you don't even have the most basic things in place? And this is something that we can say it's a development issue, but it's also a climate issue. Because when climate effects will come, as you were saying, droughts or floods and these things, how are you going to react if you don't have the most basic in place? So, and you don't need very sophisticated models for that. So my point here is that we have to reach, given that we are not being able to propose and get adaptation projects approved, and given that we are struggling to justify the climate rationale of those adaptation measures, but at the same time, the climate experts are telling us these are the most effective measures. There's something we have to look at in terms of the adaptation and what do we mean with additionality and how we can interpret that. Because it's also true, and I think that there is a fear of substitution, no? Okay, this is a project that could be funded by development funds. But if you have a country like, let's say, Togo, with 20-something% of people rely on surface water and all that, is one climate funding substituting everything? I think we have to also try to agree on when substitution and non-additionality is really a risk, and when we are just trying to build a minimum adaptive capacity, which is something that will help us in any climate regime. So I leave it there, and thank you for the opportunity to give a few words.
Thanks for that, Alejandro, and I think it's very interesting. You are referring to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the fifth assessment report that indeed talks about climate risk, as we have seen before, as a component of the hazards on one side, the exposure that communities face to these hazards, and then the vulnerability component, right? So you have mentioned, obviously, communities that don't have access to water and sanitation. They are very vulnerable, right? They are already per se very vulnerable. If we overlap this vulnerability with climate hazards and the exposure that the community and the water and supply and sanitation systems face, I think here is where we can start building the narrative, right? And I think you have mentioned, it's been discussed today about the complex data that may be needed, but in some cases, there is already observed impacts and information that is already available. Not all has to be projections towards the end of the year that we know that they are difficult to scale down. And I think Kathleen now from OECD will also help us think through that. But it's just to say that if the risk component is vulnerability, is exposure, and is the hazards, I think like reducing vulnerability should be right and a key adaptation component that we should be able to build the climate rationale on that, and reducing exposure, right? Reducing exposure, strengthening, as we saw on the webinars 1 and 2, strengthening the resilience of water and sanitation systems, and not only the systems but the whole governance that comes around. Perhaps just in just 1 minute, I wanted to just to give a little bit more of concreteness. Maybe if I'm going to put you in the spotlight now, Alejandro, if you could share with us in just a few seconds something tangible that CB is doing, in terms of navigating this. I mean, how are you helping countries navigating these processes in terms of understanding about these issues of the climate rationale? If you want to give us a little hint of something tangible so that we put a little bit our feet on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I'm conscious of time. I'm seeing Kathleen there as well. But then just 2 tracks for us. One is, let's say, trying to put advocacy and data on the public domain and having these discussions, right? And we recently concluded a research with the SEI on sanitation and climate and the finance gaps. And that is very important because it's also a part of it. And addressing this question like Madagascar on what can be done with ODF, and trying to start to open that discussion, see how this can be also addressed from a climate perspective. On the other side, to try to support countries to access funding and financing. So currently we are collaborating with UNICEF on supporting a number of countries on understanding this, what are the climate policy landscape, and then trying to and the risk, and then trying to build this climate rationale for different potential actions. So I'll stop there. But yeah, also we have been in working with UNDP on that same support at times in particular countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you. It's very good to hear that things, that we can start working that way if we haven't done it before, and that is not impossible to do these things that we are discussing. Thank you again, Alejandro, as like we said, CV Director for Water and Sanitation. Now we are super excited to finally be able to have Kathleen Dominic, who is lead financing water at the OECD. Kathleen, you've been waiting there patiently, and we are looking forward to have your remarks on how from your perspective from the OECD, how do you see climate financing? How do you see these things that we are discussing? And you have obviously the broader financing perspective and context. So if you can share with us what are your thoughts? I mean, you have the benefit of, having gone through all the speakers and all the points have been made, so you can let us know what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Excellent, and thank you, Jose, so much for the invitation. I've really been delighted to hear this very interesting discussion, great presentations. And indeed, there's an advantage to kind of coming in at the end, because I'm going to pick up on just the points that I really want to underscore, and I think resonate with some other points that other speakers made. So maybe just to start with one point related to tracking climate finance. So the presentation from Jonathan at the beginning was very good, and OECD does a lot of work in this area to track climate flows. And indeed, we see that climate finance flows are increasing over time, but fairly slowly. And as Jonathan mentioned, mitigation still largely dominates, even if the flows for adaptation are increasing at a faster rate. They're increasing more quickly, but from a lower base. But I think one interesting point to note from OECD analysis is that, in fact, the focus of climate finance in low-income countries differs substantially than for developing countries on average. So what we see there in the low-income countries is that there's more emphasis on adaptation, there's more emphasis on grant financing, and water and sanitation and agriculture. All of those represent higher shares of climate finance tracked. So I think that's interesting. I think it's also a bit of a positive message around sort of the allocation of that type of financing for low-income countries. Now, three points I really like to stress that emerge from our work. And the first point is around sort of thinking about where to place the frame, if you will. So here we're talking about climate finance for WASH resilience, but I think we also want to make sure we're talking about ensuring WASH resilience, whatever the financing source, right? So financing WASH and water more generally can benefit from climate finance, but of course we have to always remember this is just one potential source and not the largest one. And we have to make sure that other flows for financing are contributing to that resilience, right? And then I think there's a connected point here, and it really, I think, resonates with what Pradeep was saying. Here is when you're considering some of the requirements of dedicated climate funds, right, that we've heard about, that are looking for funding interventions with a systemic transformation, paradigm shifts, not business as usual. The WASH and water and water security advocates or people working in those sectors, we should be looking for strategic ways to include WASH and water more broadly in those broader climate resilience plans and funding proposals, right? So the starting point doesn't always have to be WASH, but thinking about ways that you connect it to those broader plans and funding proposals, right? So positioning WASH and water security as an enabler for multiple sectors to become more resilient, right? So that gets us out of maybe a more narrow getting climate finance for WASH, but also thinking, well, how can we connect and show we're relevant to other sectors, right? So I think that's important to think about. The second point would be around, and this Pradeep also mentioned this notion of sort of leveraging other finance, and I think that's really important because the climate flows are important, but they're small, right, compared to overall needs. And so thinking about how climate and other types of development finance can mobilize additional capital, right? So our work on blended finance, for example, shows that there's opportunities to crowd in that commercial capital, but this is not done at scale. And we need to look for ways to use those limited funds in a strategic way to crowd in other sources. So this is also something I think if built into proposals and investment approaches, shows that you're moving away from a business as usual type of approach. Now, to do that, there's also a need to think about the enabling environment for investment, right? So it's not just about preparing projects and project proposals and saying, okay, now we need funding for that, but looking upstream and saying, okay, how do we strengthen the enabling environment for investment? How do we strengthen those policies, those institutional arrangements? And I really liked the speaker from Togo's emphasis on institutional strengthening, how important that is, right? And then finally, connected to this as well, is thinking about having a focus on the strategic planning beyond just project preparation, thinking about a number of different projects that can be enablers for resilience at a landscape scale, cross-sectoral, et cetera. And I think that's a way to build WASH and water into a broader vision. Then the final point is just to underscore the fact that in our work, we do try to emphasize that the financing discussion is not only about mobilizing more money and crowding in more money, even though that's needed, but it's also about maintaining and adapting the assets that we already have, right? And channeling the existing flows to where it's most needed, ensuring those are going towards resilience and avoiding maladaptation, right? So even if it's not dedicated climate funds, but making sure we're not spending money on projects designed on past climate patterns that may fail to deliver in a changing climate. So that also provides a bit more of a holistic approach to making sure that that actually comes back to my first point, is that there's the need for climate finance for water, but also all water finance should be going towards resilience, and hopefully those will be reinforcing. And I wrap it up there to have time for questions or other interactions.
No, thank you very much, Kathleen. I think that was very, very interesting and also refreshing to hear, you know, as we said, from your broader perspective of financing for the water and the water sector, to hear, you know, some of the things at the end. The climate funding is one part of the game. Sometimes I think in the water sector we have felt that we are missing this boat with the climate financing, and then we have to, but not to lose perspective, right, of the whole picture of the financing for the sector is much broader than these schemes that we're seeing. The adaptation needs are huge, but so are the needs to achieve SDG 6 and to achieve universal access to water and sanitation. And surely it doesn't look like that's going to be solved with climate financing. Also super interesting that you pick up from the Togo presentation on the institutional strengthening. We are talking about proposals that are pretty comprehensive, that they are not just to cover some kind of smart technologies. And, you know, sometimes in the water sector, we are a bunch of, in many cases, engineers and civil engineers that we get very bogged down with the technicalities and the infrastructure. But this is as well as supporting the whole enabling environment, the governance, the standards for the water sector, and go beyond. And actually, this is one of the ways, in my understanding, that these proposals can also showcase the replicability, scalability, and how this will go, as you very rightly said, from a one-time off intervention in a very localized part. You know, this, as we have heard, these proposals should be transformational. They are not just meant to have like a very reduced scope. We need to see how they transpire beyond the boundaries of the projects that are selected and the communities that may more directly benefit, but they need to show how this funding is somehow catalytic and transformative in a way that goes beyond that. I see that there are some questions in the chat box that I have to admit I haven't been able to react, because I was doing my best to facilitate the discussion with you, Kathleen, and Alejandro. I think we are on the time right now. I could say that I hope that by this time, you know, with these three webinars, we have got to a point where we understand. I could just, if I need to finalize with 1 minute remark, is this bi-directional work is not the water sector alone. Is we need to work with the climate community. We need to work with the water resources sector. We need to utilize, as Kathleen was saying right now, opportunities to fit in with what other sectors are already doing. We need to make sure that we make our space in those very clearly. And again, to emphasize is that these are slow processes. The things are not solved overnight. We have seen the flow diagram at the beginning, stakeholder mapping, understanding who is going to be our partner in the water sector to work and embrace with resilience, emphasize the importance of the policies and making sure that that WAS is integrated in climate policies and the other way around. We have seen how risk assessment can help us building this climate rationale that we have discussed extensively today, and that's necessary to be able to craft the solutions for your local context, those that we are then looking for financing. And I hope that you got some pointers today from the climate financing perspective as to what is needed and how can we move from the water sector forward. I hope that you found this, not only this webinar, but the whole series of the 3 webinars useful. They are all recorded and they are made available on our website. Also to say that this webinar series has been convened with the Global Water Partnership, UNICEF and WaterAid. But again, you will find all the recordings available on the SWA, the Sanitation and Water for All website. Thank you. That's all from our side now.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.